Okay, let's finish up imperialism with American imperialism part two. And again, this is the part where America becomes the world power. And this next section, I've titled it American Imperialism for a reason because America's going to have its own brand here. And I use the word brand loosely, but we're going to do things a little differently than the European powers do in their imperialist, conquest and how they administer their own empires. So I think it's pretty. I think it's okay for us to call it American imperialism at this time. So much like the last couple of sections, we're going to end up with a question here, and it says, "Where and how does America practice its brand of imperialism?" And so that's what we're going to look at: what parts of the world, and how do we do it, and what do we quote get out of it? And when we look at it, we got to start with Hawaii. And Hawaii is one of those places today that you go on big vacations and things like that. Or there's that very bad movie Pearl Harbor that takes a look at it. Um, but when you look at Hawaii in the later stages of the 19th century, this particular image right here is one that you would have seen in magazines. And when you take a look at Queen Liliuokalani, the daughter of King Kamehameha, one of the first things you notice is the very caricaturistic view they're showing of her, very exaggerated features, and look at what's in her hands: gross immorality on one and scandalous government on the other. Neither of which was true of Queen Liliuokalani, and the throne she's sitting on is being propped up by you can see those are American soldiers at the bottom, so they've been propped up by American bayonets. And this is one of those views that tends to be propagated in some of the news media, and we're going to kind of see why in just a minute as America begins to look outward. Now, here is an actual image of Queen Liliuokalani. Nothing like what we just saw on that nasty, awful cartoon. But one of the reasons Queen Lily finds herself in the crosshairs of American imperialist policy is because of where she rules. And if you take a look at the map on the left-hand side here, you're going to notice that if America is going to expand into the Pacific and find itself in markets such as China and other parts of the Far East, um, Hawaii is kind of that crossroads. Okay, we mentioned that much earlier with the idea of Pearl Harbor being as a refueling stop, and there's going to be some other places throughout the Pacific, but this is the big one. This is the big waypoint right here. And if you notice, all the big trade routes just about come through Hawaii, and so Queen Lily and this government's going to find itself in the crosshairs of American business, American missionaries, and American imperialists. And so when you look at old Sanford Dole down there, he's got one of the coolest beards in all of history, but he's also just not a very nice person. And you look at the time period, it's 1894. This is, right on the cusp of all of America's imperialist ambitions. We're looking 25 years since Seward's Folly in Alaska. And so what Sanford Dole of the Dole listen to me, the Dole Fruit Company, which is still around in some iteration today, him and people like him decide to proclaim the Republic of Hawaii and depose and arrest Queen Liliuokalani, who did absolutely nothing. So they decide this is what we're going to do because Hawaii needs to be American. That's the sole reason for it. We're going to trump up some reasons. We're going to hatch this coup in so many ways, and Hawaii is going to be American. We're going to see that little strategy play itself out throughout the world as this course rolls along. So what happens is 4 years later, Hawaii officially is annexed as a territory. Originally, the American president told him to give it back, and then they're kind of like, well, we can't really do that. So Hawaii is not something that the government set out to take over, but it has done so by these industrialists, and in this case, a fruit industry right there that had so much land and so many things tied up in Hawaii. when you have a queen who's saying, you know what, Hawaii needs to be for Hawaiians. Anyway, you see that conflict there when there's the ability of the Hawaiian government at that time to throw out some of these companies. Well, it's time to depose them, which is exactly what happens. And not only is Hawaii going to be one of the focal points, but also Cuba is. Cuba had found itself in the sights of American expansion as far back as the 1850s, um, with some of the groups that you would call filibusters of the day looking to annex Cuba basically as a slave and incorporate it as a slave state to kind of balance that power in the Senate that was so important during that time. But now that we're in the later portion of the 19th century, that's not the goal, but there is a lot of sugar production and there is a lot of food production. You have a lot of business interest tied up there. And as you can see, this frying pan that is sitting over the fire of anarchy has what it looks like, maybe possibly a Hispanic woman here. It's going to be that version of Lady Liberty that we have seen in other, memes of the day or other cartoons, but now Spanish misrule is fueling this anarchy that's causing liberty in Cuba to perish. Okay, that's a very self-serving look at it, depending upon who you are. And then you look at these images here. This is not a Nazi concentration camp from the Second World War. These are some of the, relocation camps of Valeriano Weyler's rule in Cuba. And of course, you're not going to stand for this kind of stuff. This is what's going on down in Cuba. It's 90 miles from Key West. What are we going to do about it? I want you to keep that in mind as we move through this part. So if you see here, causes of the Spanish-American War, and if you've done your reading in the American Yelp, you know we're going to have one. And it's all caused by the Cuban Revolution in 1895, right on the heels of our annexation of Hawaii. And what happens is Cuba wants Spain gone. Spain has controlled that since hundreds of years on back, and they want Spain gone. Spain's like, no, this is a very profitable colony of ours, and we want to keep it in the fold and keep utilizing it for the wealth that's there. Now, the problem is a lot of American companies have invested in Cuba. So you have some sizable investment there. You have companies with millions of dollars tied up in it. And Spain sends Valeriano Weyler, who becomes known as the Butcher. They send him to kind of put down this Cuban Revolution. Well, some people he packs up, he sends them to camps, which you saw the imagery a minute ago. And in America, you have a period of what's termed yellow journalism. And you have William Randolph Hearst and William Pulitzer. Yeah, I got those right. Who are vying to sell more newspapers, and the more sensational the stories, the more newspapers you can sell. It's kind of like when I was in high school and college, and we'd go to the grocery store, and you would see the National Enquirer. I mean, I remember, they had a picture of Bill Clinton meeting with the space alien. I'm like, okay, whatever. But that kind of yellow journalism at the time, people accepted a lot of it as fact. And so Pulitzer and Hearst there are trying to get the most sensational reports. A lot of them based in some truth, but then you take that truth and you exaggerate it, okay? Then you're going to get the Dupuy de Lome letter that we're going to see in a minute. Then all this stuff's going on. All these images are floating around. All this idea of somebody's being mean and bad to the Cubans. All this American money tied up in Cuba. And so what does the government do? We send the USS Maine down to Havana Harbor in one brand new battleship. As a matter of fact, the mast of the Maine is in Arlington Cemetery today. And so they send the Maine down. And the idea of the Maine there is that, we'll tell them we can evacuate Americans if things get bad, or we can protect American interest. In reality, that big battleship sitting there showing you that America's not going to let you do what we don't want you to. Okay, whatever. We do the same thing with aircraft carriers today. Anytime something gets crafty in the Middle East, boom, here comes another aircraft carrier. Well, the problem with the USS Maine, though, is it had the nerve to explode. And so naturally now it's got to be Spain's fault. They must have put a mine, or they put a bomb, or they did something bad. The captain of the Maine himself, he telegraphs the Navy, and he says to suspend judgment. He doesn't believe this happened. Now, It's only been a little over 120 something years since this happened, and we have finally figured out it was probably a fire in a coal bunker. And apparently, those things can spontaneously ignite. So you got to be real careful with them. And in Philadelphia to this day is the USS Olympia, which is a cruiser, and it was the flagship of Commodore Dewey, who we're going to see in a minute. But parts of its construction are very similar to the Maine, especially internally. And they figured out that this thing could have caught fire and blown up on its own. And then the Congress is going to quickly pass, as we're debating whether or not to go to war, which seems to be a foregone conclusion. They're going to pass this thing called the Teller Amendment. Notice I put a little asterisk out the side of it, and there's a reason. Because the Teller Resolution says real quick that we're not going to take Cuba over. Which at the end of it, we're all sitting around like, ugh, that was not a good idea. But America really wanted to be seen as not just an imperial grab, but as, oh, we're trying to do something great and good for the Cuban people until we think better of that a little later. And so here you see Pulitzer and Hearst. I mean, Hearst is going to send Frederick Remington down to Cuba. Frederick Remington, incredible painter and sculptor, very famous, provided a lot of pictures for the newspapers. And Hearst told Remington, said, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. So these two guys, they have got folks on the take in telegraph offices. I mean, they're going to actually come up with a diplomatic cable here in just a minute to help spark this war. These guys stop at nothing to sell papers. And so you see that button that says remember the Maine. One of the rallying cries of that day was not just remember the Maine, but it was remember the Maine and to hell with Spain. You see the funeral procession here in America. You see the Spanish at the bottom right, and I hate that the picture in my head is sitting in that way. But you see the Spanish portrayed as this guerrilla. This is an excuse here. And again, the captain of the Maine's like to suspend judgment. Matter of fact, that telegram is sitting in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. to this day. You can go see it. It's kind of cool. But you see the Maine there. So this is kind of one of our excuses. The Spanish did it. And then Dupuy de Lome was the Spanish ambassador to America. And to this day, you have these things called diplomatic pouches where you send secure communications that nobody's supposed to look at. Well, this is supposed to go to it'd be a secure telegram. Well, of course, it was Hearst or Pulitzer. I can't remember which one it was. One of them had a guy in the telegraph office that was on the take. He gets a hold of this. Instead of doing what he's supposed to with it, he takes it back to them. It gets printed in the paper, and you see what it says. So McKinley's weak. Okay. He's a bidder for the admiration of the crowd, in every politician. He tries to leave the door open behind himself while keeping on good terms with the Jingos or the nationalists of his party. There's nothing here that any of us wouldn't say. But the fact now that it's official and it's in the paper, we're already mad at Spain and they're doing these things and they may have blown up the USS Maine. We're marching toward conflict here. And so what happens is we're going to call this a splendid little war because it's not really big. Not a lot of people die in it. And America gets a lot of cool stuff. And the main reason for American victory is that naval superiority. Alfred Thayer Mahan was right about that big Navy when it comes to this particular point in history. So the war doesn't start in Cuba, though that's going to be the focal point. It actually starts over in Manila Bay, where George Dewey gives the command to fire on the Spanish fleet. He says, fire when ready, Quigley. And in Manila Bay, they sink almost the entire Spanish fleet that was there, and America suffers one casualty. And it was a guy who got heat exhaustion in the boiler room of one of the ships. I mean, you think about that. It's probably only 100,000 degrees down there. And so what happens? So America sends this army over. And Teddy Roosevelt, who is rising in his political ambitions, comes from a very wealthy family. He is going to help raise a group of volunteers at places like the Menger Bar in San Antonio. So being a volunteer, he can't be officially in charge. That's going to be Leonard Wood. But Teddy Roosevelt's going to get all the press. Him and what he calls his Rough Riders, because he gathers them from all parts of the West. They get famous for their charge up San Juan Hill. And America loves a war hero, absolutely loves it. And, George Washington, U.S. Grant, Andrew Jackson, in the 20th century, you end up with Dwight Eisenhower, all that. But the bigger battle that was in Cuba was the charge up Kettle Hill by African American infantry. But you can't be talking about that at that time. That doesn't excite the national interest or the white interest. But anyway, so you've got that going on. Very few Americans dying. Big victories. Spanish fleet is destroyed. Spain surrenders to the United States. So what you have is America for the first time since we defeated, or actually fought Great Britain to a draw in the War of 1812, has went to war with a European power and defeated them and taken part of their shiny stuff. And that's exactly what we're going to do. And as you can see here, the war doesn't start, like I said, in Cuba. It starts all the way across the world over in the Philippines. Okay, so America's going to get them too. And then the Filipinos were kind of happy for the Spanish to be thrown out until they figured out real quick that we're just like them. In there, you see a map of the whole thing sailing from Tampa. I mean, this is, if you want to have a war, this is a splendid little war. And here's the rise of Theodore Roosevelt. Okay, again, this is from the Roosevelt collection at Harvard College, which he was an alum of. You see at the top right, one of the famous paintings of his charge up San Juan Hill. It didn't go that way. Matter of fact, there was time they had to have help from certain groups. But you see this picture here of Teddy. And of Teddy here, when you see this is the guy, and this is the persona he wants to create, and this is the persona he's going to eventually create for the United States. But now we've got to say, we not only have a good war, a quick war, a victorious war, we have ourselves a hero, and you know what that means. He's going to end up on the national political stage. So as a result, America does become a world power. We had been an industrial powerhouse for decades. Now we're going to be a political powerhouse as well. And it's something that every single one of us experiences to this day. So the war's going to end with the Treaty of Paris of 1898, which is like the third, fourth, 10th, 100th Treaty of Paris that we did, that we see throughout American history. But one of the big points, number one, Cuba gets freed from Spanish rule. Okay, wow, they're going to get American rule, but whatever. Spain gives up Puerto Rico and Guam. America pays $20 million for the Philippines, not for Puerto Rico and Guam. We're going to pay $20 million for the Philippines. Nobody bothered to ask them, but whatever. And so now we, in essence, control Cuba. And now we got Puerto Rico and Guam, and we just got Hawaii. And there's going to be some other little places like Wake Island over there, and American Samoa. So all of a sudden, we have found ourselves a ready-made empire. Okay, and so we're going to have one, and it's going to spread far and wide. It's not going to be quite as impressive as some of the European countries, especially like the British Empire, but it's going to be incredibly strategically important as we move through the next 50 years. But, but back home in America, there's really a debate over an empire. Well, you got this thing called the Anti-Imperialist League, and we'll see some pieces of that in a moment. But one of the big members was William Jennings Bryan. Another one was Mark Twain. A lot of Southern and Western Democrats who don't like this expansion. They fear cheap agricultural products coming and competing with what they're doing, and especially with the absolutely incredibly cheap labor that is going to be able to come from these far-flung places. Okay, like the Philippines, and so they're going to start to use some altruistic ideas, things like, oh, it's an assault on Filipino rights. Well, it is, but that's not their reason. It may be William Jennings Bryan's reason, but it's much more pragmatic. It's about the money. Okay, and so you see here, I've got businessmen and laborers fear that competition from the Philippines, and that never materializes, but the potential was there. Then, whether it's Pearl Harbor, whether it's Subic Bay in the Philippines, whether, wherever it is, these outposts are incredibly expensive, and they say that they're not worth the economic benefit. Though, actually, I'm going to hold off, and we're going to deal with that a little later as we get toward Pearl Harbor. And then there's this idea, these racist motives that you don't need to contaminate, the native population here in America. Whatever, we hear that stuff today. But the point of it is, there is this debate. Okay, because America found itself born of an empire, and now we're going out and taking one. So the question becomes, can we be an imperial republic? And some people argue that absolutely you could. I mean, they'll use the example of Rome and some other things. But there's some powerful examples, like the European analogies. We're born from that, from breaking away from that. Okay, then you look back at Rudyard Kipling's poem, "The White Man's Burden," that I had in the last lecture. I mean, why do you want to add more burden to yourself? Why do we want to go civilize and Christianize and do everything else for these heathen people? You know, the sloth and heathen folly that he talked about, that we just don't want to do that. Then, you know, if you do that, if you have these places, you have to be able to protect them, which means we have to be able to project power. That's why today, when America sends over a carrier battle group, that's what we're doing. We're projecting power. Back then, we would send over those battleships like the Maine or the Oregon or some of the other ones that are going to come along later. So they're saying it's just not worth it. But it was the other side, they're saying, listen, we have, and the mode of Frederick Jackson Turner, the frontier is the essence of America, and the only place left to go is into the Pacific and into the Caribbean to a lesser extent. You know, all these resources that we're going to need are there. Just wait till in the Dutch East Indies they find oil and figure out that rubber is incredibly important for an industrial economy, and those two things are going to cause some big time problems when we get, you know, into the 1930s. And then there's this very real idea that American ideals can be spread throughout the globe by us doing these things. Okay, I think, you know, you go back into the George W. Bush presidency where they talked a lot about nation building in the Middle East. That is an extension of this right here, of that philosophy from this time period, that we can extend the reach of our ideals and our institutions and our thought processes to the rest of the world. And again, here is the anti-imperialist. Look at Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, William James's philosophy of pragmatism. You know, so there are. If you see this not agenda. What am I thinking about? Kind of like a church bulletin is really what it is, about this meeting in Chicago. And if you're having big rallies like that, this is not isolated. So the idea behind this is going to permeate part of America's thought, and you're going to see that as we get into World War One, and then back away and retreat into isolationism is almost this same sort of reaction right here. People saying we shouldn't have done it in the first place. We should not have got involved in the first place. So these thought processes are going to still be there, and they're going to continue to come around again and again, even to this very day. Now, if we go to the Philippines, now my picture just got over Emilio Aguinaldo's head there. Sorry about that. They were thrilled about getting rid of the Spanish. They're not thrilled about getting the Americans. And Emilio Aguinaldo, who's not exactly completely Filipino, he leads a multi-year insurgency. Well, you know what? It was the Spanish we were fighting. Now let's just fight the Americans. It's going to take years, and it's going to take thousands of American troops, and it's going to be tens of thousands of people dead in the Philippines in order to subject them. And so now all of a sudden we look remarkably like the Europeans that we were trying so desperately not to be like. And as a matter of fact, Philippines are not going to gain their independence until after World War One. And this is one of those pictures right here that has so many things wrong with it, but is so interesting to look at. William McKinley with his really cool eyebrows. I mean, no dust is getting in this man's eye. But behind him, you see Napoleon on one side, you see Caesar on the other. You know, trying to put him in the same, in in the same paragraph as these guys. You know, hey, Napoleon, Caesar, William McKinley. But the problem is, you look at the picture at the bottom, it's the Philippines, and he's stepping on, and there is that grossly caricatured view of Filipinos. I know a tremendous number of Filipinos, and none of them, nobody looks like that. But that's what's being spread in America. This is why Rudyard Kipling and his idea of the white man's burden. This is the type of savage they want you to think it is. And so what happens is one of the men sent out here to help pacify and govern the Philippines is a man by the name of William Howard Taft. And now you see Taft's picture on the left. Taft is not a small man. He's going to have some problems later. He's actually going to get stuck in the White House tub. And after he leaves the White House, he's going to become a Supreme Court justice, which is not usual. There was a lot of talk of President Obama doing that after he left office, and I was like, there's precedent for it. But the reason I put him on here is neither of those things. Is look at the quote. When he gets to the Philippines, he calls them our little brown brothers. Could you imagine a politician or statesman saying that today? Absolutely not. But back then, this was considered a very benevolent phrase. Oh, he's being good to them. They're our little brothers. Mm. And now we got to deal with Cuba and Puerto Rico. Now, remember that Teller resolution I talked about where it said, we're not going to take over Cuba? We've spent a lot of money and a lot of treasure and a lot of people in order to kick the Spanish out. So Congress quickly passes the Platt Amendment that says we can interfere in it any time we want to. Now we're going to forget the Forker Act because you're not going to see it again. But what ends up happening is the question becomes: are these areas that we've taken in, or where like Guam or Puerto Rico, or to a lesser extent the Philippines, not Cuba because we didn't officially take it, but are the people of those places American citizens? And you get a series of Supreme Court cases known as the insular cases that says that that citizenship does not follow the flag. So that means we can make up the rules as we go along and apply it here and not apply it there. Kind of an interesting turn of events. But what happens is the Caribbean becomes, quote, an American Mediterranean, or an American lake, I think is probably a better term. And here's the four pieces of the Platt Amendment right here. Not something we're going to stop and deal with, but if you look at number 2, it says America could intervene in Cuban affairs if it is necessary to maintain an efficient, independent government. Maybe somebody needs to intervene in Washington these days. But in number 3, Cuba's got at least Guantanamo Bay to the U.S. still there, still a little bit of an issue, a thorn in the side for relations here. Colonel Jessup and a few good men. That's where he was stationed. So one more cartoon of McKinley with his crazy eyebrows there, and you look at Cuba and Puerto Rico, and I can't see the other one out there because I do not have my glasses on while I'm doing this, but they're almost like little children. And again, this is in that same vein of the Rudyard Kipling poem, The White Man's Burden. And you can see there with Kipling, and you can see how they're characterizing the people in these particular places. Again, something that we would never even think about doing today, but was very common 130 years ago. So we're going to finish this up with Theodore Roosevelt here for just a second, because though in terms of your textbook he's not yet become vice president or president, it makes no sense not to deal with him right here. And when he becomes president, he is going to be a massive driving force in U.S. foreign policy. I mean, we're going to end up with the Panama Canal through him and some other things that today we still deal with. Because you think about this, Teddy Roosevelt always had the phrase, he said, you got to be somebody, you got to get action. And he thought that our country, much like any individual worth anything, has to strive for greatness. When he was president, he used to love to pick on the German ambassador. And Teddy was a pretty good sized dude. He lifted weights and did all this crazy stuff. And he would invite the German ambassador over to eat lunch. And so the German ambassador had to come, and they're eating all this crap. And then Roosevelt would want to go do something like hike or play tennis or box. And he would do it until the German ambassador would physically get ill and throw up. And that was his way of kind of beating him down. Okay? That's Roosevelt. He thinks countries should be like that. We got to strive for greatness. We got to be somebody. We got to get action, and we got to make people bow to us. And then that goes right along the lines of the idea that Americans are supposedly racially superior, but destined for supremacy. And I mean in economic affairs and political affairs, and eventually in military affairs. That's going to be part of Roosevelt's mantra. But he's also really good at analyzing international problems. I mean, he's going to win a Nobel Peace Prize for basically negotiating the end of the Russo-Japanese War. I mean, like I said, we get Panama. He does all these cool things, and he says no, he has absolutely no patience for small countries. Puerto Rico, all the ones that we're gathering up, their claims to sovereignty or human rights. No, 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 no. I'm sorry. America's the stronger country. We're going to dominate you. We're going to bring our brand to you. We're going to run this as we see fit. We're going to civilize you. Which leads us to a document. is document the right word? Anyway, it's going to be a concept known as the Roosevelt Corollary, or Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine from History 151 says that no foreign countries get to play around on our side of the world, and you can't do this, and you can't colonize, and you got to leave them to their own devices and let them let them develop in their own ways. Well, the Roosevelt corollary starts on a place called Venezuela. That's still a little problem today, and then the Dominican Republic, and all these countries are building up these huge debts, and they owe it to these European banks and these European countries, and they're afraid those European countries are going to come over and they're going to take them over in violation of the Monroe Doctrine. So what happens is Roosevelt says that America is going to intervene. And we're going to intervene due to stability. We're not bringing social justice. We're not bringing democracy. We're bringing stability. We're keeping the European powers out. And I absolutely love this cartoon right here. You know, you see the Republic of Santo Domingo, and again, you can tell that it's whoever the author of this thing is considers it to them to be inferior. But you see this gigantic naval rifle with Monroe's doctrine on the head of it, pointed at some king's head. And what's going to happen is Roosevelt gives us some good verbiage here. He talks about chronic wrongdoing. I'm not sure anybody was really had chronic wrongdoing, but he's talking about incurring these debts and not having a decent government. Ultimately require intervention by some, quote, civilized nation, i.e. America, in the Western Hemisphere. Okay? That America is going to reluctantly, but will go out in cases of such wrongdoing. We are going to exercise an international police power. Famous cartoon of Roosevelt in an old policeman's outfit, spinning a nightstick, going, tell your troubles to the policeman. Though I like this one right here better for this, because you see the gun pointed directly at the king. And how can we do this? That great white fleet that he's going to send around the world, those battleships in the American military are going to be powerful enough to enforce it. So, to finish this all up here in just about the 30-minute mark, you look at all these places that America got. Cuba, we never did officially take it, but we're going to control it. Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Panama a little bit later, Nicaragua, Mexico, to a greater or lesser degree, we're going to try to control them, but they're much like a teenager that you can't control. But we're going to see there is this whole area becomes an American lake or an American Mediterranean, and America now has itself an empire, and now all the problems of governing are going to reside with us.